Turning some lights on inside Elliot's Law. The sun is starting to go down in the northeast, and we got to light things up a little bit. Welcome to When Black Men Talk. I'm Mark Elliott, your host. I've been doing this for quite some time, and one of the great things about hosting a podcast, you get a chance to meet some very interesting people. And tonight, or I should say, this episode is going to be no different. I have the honor of having someone that has double doctorate degrees, 15 years in practice, helped over 33,000 couples change their lives. Think about that for a second. Over 33,000 couples change their lives. A best-selling author, host of podcasts, a board-certified sexologist. I never talked to a sexologist before, so this is really going to be interesting for me. I'm speaking of Dr. Diane Muller. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. Well, welcome to your first conversation with a sexologist. It's going to be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Now, I have to ask this because I'm just wondering, because we all choose and have different lanes we go into. How did you get the inclination to arrive to become a sexologist?
Good question. So the initial part of the journey actually started when I was in my early 20s. I was raised super Catholic, super religious. And so sex was like just for marriage. Masturbation was off the table. It was like everything was just conversations about down there, if there was conversations at all. So that's where I came from. And it was really interesting. In my early 20s, I started developing this vulvar pain, and nobody could figure out what it was. It was like, multiple doctors, multiple tests. Everything was normal, which is great, but it was like this pain that was keeping me up at night. And I had a roommate at the time in college, a very good friend of mine at the time. And she, interestingly enough, was like the opposite of me from a standpoint of just like openness around sex. And she started talking to me one day about her masturbation practice. And she handed me this book after I was telling her about my sleepless nights. She handed me this book. It was called Sex for One. And you can imagine what the book is about. It's about masturbation and the power of pleasure. But in the book, it actually talked a little bit about how people were using masturbation to heal various types of pain. So lying in bed, miserable one night, I just was like, all right, I'm just going to go for it. I was just like at my wit's end, even though it was against everything that I thought to be true at that point in time. And I masturbated for the first time. And oh my gosh, Mark, like it was crazy because my pain was gone. And then it came back the next night and I masturbated again and my pain was gone again. And this happened several times in a row. And then the pain was totally gone, never came back. So I have theories now that I'm in the medical profession about what it was back then. This is well over 2 decades ago. And but like what it really started for me was this curiosity around like, okay, so even in terms of God, like this is like me and my mental process back then, like even in terms of God, how could something that is so healing, that is bringing, like that is changing my body and getting me out of this pain, how could something be bad? So it actually started, it was like kind of the awakening for me to reorient. And that's where I kind of coined the term that I use a lot, which is pleasure is not just about desire, but something we require. Because it really made me very, very interested around like, how could this thing that I've been told was bad is like the very thing that actually brought me peace and sleep and healing and all these things. So away the journey began.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, a lot of times when we hear the word sexologist, our mind runs all over the place. We're not sure what really goes behind it. So what are the foundational elements of a sexologist?
Sure. I mean, ology as a suffix in terminology, right, from a root word perspective, just means the study of. So a sexologist by definition is somebody that spends a lot of time studying things like sex. And then there's boards that will validate that, your credentials and validate what you're doing and validate what you're researching and certify you from just looking at your life's work and looking at your influence in this. So that's basically where the board certification, as a sexologist comes in. It's from having a recognized board actually come in and be like, oh yeah, We see what you're doing. We see what you're putting into time for this. And so some of my interest, right, is in like actually understanding things like desire and passion and how to keep things hot in novelty in marriage and long-term relationships, and really understanding what is happening to the chemistry of the mind in these scenarios to keep people either moving closer to each other or moving further away. So it's really the study of sex, of desire, of love, of relationships, of intimacy, of oxytocin, closeness, and all those things.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Now
fun.
that makes me, yeah, that makes me think because when I hear you speak of desire and passion, and a lot of times when, let's say, man meets woman, woman meets man, in the beginning, they have that uncontrollable emotion, basically. But as time starts to go on, sometimes it starts to fade. And you're the perfect person to speak to about this. What are some of the factors that you think are behind it fading? And I'm not going to say quickly, but over a period of time, sometimes that passion starts to dwindle.
Yeah, so I'll answer that first by telling a story that this was the first thing that made me start questioning this, which was I was listening to this lecture by Richard Bandler, who's the founder of a program, a mind technique for reprogramming the mind in more positive ways called neurolinguistic programming. And I was listening to his lecture by him, and he was talking about before he got married. He was saying, yeah, everybody was coming up to me and saying that the sex, the intimacy, the passion was going to die. And he said he took a step back and he was like, this doesn't actually make sense. You mean I'm going to practice something over and over and over again and get worse at it? And, when you think about it, right, like what else in life do we do over and over and over and over and over again and get worse at it? And it is interesting when it comes to these long-term relationships because that is what is happening. And it doesn't make sense when we actually look at it from that standpoint. If we practice guitar, if we practice our craft, whatever our work is, if we practice any sport, we're going to get better and better and better typically the more hours we put into it. So this is what I help to break down for people in my work. And there's a couple different things that are happening here. The first to mention is this kind of energy you're talking about, that like that hotness in the beginning, that passion in the beginning. We often call it the new relationship energy. And it's in part driven by dopamine. So dopamine, the neurotransmitter, the brain chemical and hormone, there's a lot of people think of it as like the reward hormone. So like we eat a really great piece of dessert and our dopamine goes up. We have great sex, our dopamine goes up. We go on some sort of epic vacation with our friends, our family, our dopamine goes up. So it's a lot about reward, but a huge part also that doesn't get talked about as much with dopamine is the desire and is the motivation. So for example, one of the things that will lead us towards actions, that motivate us towards action, is the lack of having something. So if I'm like really excited about an upcoming vacation and I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, it's going to be amazing to be on the beach, or it's going to be amazing to be in the mountains with my friends, or whatever it is, every time I think about it, I get this little big poof of dopamine in my brain. And that's going to motivate me to like take the steps to do the vacation, take the steps to plan the vacation, all those things. And the same thing's true in that new relationship energy. So what happens in the beginning is we meet somebody and we exchange phone numbers. And then it's like, oh my goodness, are they going to call? And that wondering, that anticipatory feeling will raise dopamine in the brain. And then if they do call, then we get more dopamine and now we're addicted. And then we go out on a date, if it goes well, then that we go through that cycle all over again of, are they going to kiss me? Are they going to call me? Are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? And, eventually, are we going to make love? On and on and on and on, all dopamine. Well, that space between these encounters is part of what is driving that desire. Dopamine and desire are very intricately linked. And so what can happen then, and what typically then happens, is when people get further along and they get further along into their relationship, they move in together, maybe they get married, maybe they have kids, maybe they do business together, whatever it is, where they start seeing each other all the time, where there's not that anticipatory excitement, there's not enough of that gap to create that dopamine to be released because there's not enough gap and there's not enough novelty. And so when there's not enough of those things, then that dopamine falls. And then all of a sudden that desire falls because there's not that newness. There's literally changes in the brain that are saying, oh, now I'm safe. Now I know what to expect. Now I know I'm going to see them at 5 p.m. every day and until 8 in the morning or whatever the process is. And that dopamine dries out. It's just not stimulated. And because of that, we don't have that motivation to seek each other in this exciting way unless we come in and we circumvent that.
That's real interesting. I'm wondering now. So when they're together basically every day and they see each other every day, how can they do things to basically bring that dopamine back and keep that passion alive?
It's one of the most important questions and one of the most foundational principles of the work I do. And so in understanding that space and the novelty are two ways of creating that dopamine and that drive, one of the biggest things that happens for couples when it comes to passion, let's talk about passion. One of the biggest things that happens is this like we call a sexual script. That's what we call in the sexology world. And in the sexual script, it looks like this. Maybe he starts kissing his partner, she or he responds back, they go back and forth, they go on their back, they go on their side, they do this act, they do that act, they end in climax, and it's over. And there's some process that is kind of similar to that every single time. I see this in my like daily walks. I talk about this around like, okay, well, I get up and I do a morning walk every day, and creature of habit, this is what humans do. Without even thinking about it, I just find myself on that same route unless I do something intentionally right to change it. So we got to start bringing novelty back in, and we got to start bringing novelty back in intentionally. So I'm a fan of bougie stuff. So I love what I call bougie sex. And bougie sex is all about the novelty. It's about bringing the desire in. And this is not practical to do on a, daily, and for many couples, not even on a weekly basis, but on at least a monthly basis. If we can have these types of passionate nights or these passionate dates, day, night, morning, whatever it is. And the goal here is to start to bring more novelty in. The way I bring novelty, and there's lots of different ways, but the foundational way I help people think about this is breaking it down into people, places, and things, because most things we can bring in novelty could fit into those categories. So people in monogamy, this can be simple things like role playing. This can be things like dress up, even simple things like putting a wig on or putting a different style outfit on. Another thing that can happen with like people in monogamy is all of us have these different types of like, say, archetypes inside of us. So we have the part of us that's a little more sweet. We have the part of ourselves that's a little bit more dangerous. We have the part of ourselves that's a little bit more sassy. And it can be another fun way to bring in novelty, to be like, oh, I'm going to make love tonight from the part of myself that is the sassy part. And this sounds a little like kind of out there to, sometimes say to some people, but it can really work to tune in and be like, oh, what does it look like if I actually embody this part of myself? And we tend to show up differently in the bedroom when we do that. So that's people. Places are obvious, right? So that's just different places in the house. It can be like, I've seen so much help a couple, even from just shifting from like one bedroom to another, from one couch to another, changing and being in front of the mirror, changing and being in front of another part of the house, the shower, whatever. Changing and like doing a hotel and rent room for the hour, which by the way is not sketchy. There are some sketchy places, but there's really nice places that rent room for the hour because of people that are coming through on business and just need a place to crash for a couple hours and do business. And you can find beautiful hotel rooms that will do things like rent rooms for the hour that are not sleazy at all. Just another fun way to bring novelty in. And then things can be changing lube, bringing in blindfolds, bringing in various sex toys, pumps. There's all these different things that we can bring in to add, not to take away, to enhance the situation, the intimacy. So all these different ways are examples of how we can bring novelty in. And then we can combine that with desire in part. By what's fun is so many times in long-term relationships, we've kind of lost our flirt, right? It's like we kind of just go through the motions and there's so much love, but we've lost that real flirt, and it can feel awkward. Like it can feel so awkward, this person that maybe we used to flirt with all the time, and now we're, stuck talking about the dishes and the kids and who's taking out the trash in the morning. And so when we start to bring in novelty, another thing that helps with that desire and that gap is, let's say we have our bougie date night, a couple weeks from now, and we talk about, oh, we're going to try this new place, or we're going to try this new sex toy. Then what we can do in these dates is we can actually then, for 2 weeks, you can start to bring the flirt back by saying things that are like, oh, I'm so excited about XYZ that you're going to try. And if there's almost a safety there, because now you've agreed to this thing you're going to try. So when you start to kind of flirt and tease in those 2 weeks, there's already that knowingness of this is happening. You've agreed to it. So from a vulnerability standpoint, it tends to kind of take that vulnerability out of it. And when you start to flirt in that way, guess what that's doing? That is creating that gap. Now it's going back to that new relationship energy where it's like, okay, we're going to do this new thing. What is it? Now it's a new thing. Now we're flirting about it. Now your brain is orienting to it. And now the dopamine is kicking back in.
You know, I was sitting here listening and I thought about this too, because as couples are together for a period of time, we start to age. There's the libido, and sometimes the libido may not work like our mind wants us to work. It has its own separate policy or environment. And when I was reading about you, I came across something interesting. It was, as you phrase it, it's the libido code. What's the unique libido code? How does that relate to desire and passion?
It's a huge part of it. Thank you for doing that research. So if you go to, if any listeners go to libidocode.com, you'll find a free quiz that'll go over this information. And the libido code is about kind of your genetic turn on and turn offs. It's about how you are wired. And so when you take this quiz at libidocode.com, what you'll find that oftentimes your turn-ons and your partner's turn-ons are different. So for anybody that's listened to or read the book Love Languages by Gary Chapman, it's basically a kind of like a spin-off that, but around sex and eroticism. So it's saying, okay, how are your genetics? How are your natural type of desire set up for your individual turn-on? So there's 5 different types. And the easiest one to understand, and from a standpoint of why this is important, the one I use often in example is called the sensate. Because what happens so often with our turn-ons and turn-offs, and this is where things can go haywire in long-term relationships too, is rejection. So let's say one person has a different turn-on style than another. And one person is moving down the road and they're doing something. I'm going to give a more specific example in a moment. But one person could be, really revved up. And if the other person doesn't understand it, they might completely miss the code or the cues, just like what we see in love languages. So, for example, one type is the sensate. And the sensate person is so turned on by everything of the 5 senses. So this is the person that wants to take the time to light the candles, to get the smells right in the room, to put on the perfect music, to get the right textures on their body. This is a person that might be more interested in bringing food in for their, their taste and getting turned on by that. And it's the champagne and the strawberries or whipped cream, whatever it is, right? So that person, let's say in an intimacy standpoint, let's say we have 2 people and they're starting to get it on, and the one person has a different code and they don't really care all that much about these things. It's fine, but it doesn't do anything for them. So the sensate person could interrupt like a hot and heavy, say, make out session to be like, oh, I got to go put this perfect song on right now. And if we don't understand that about a sensate, it can be very, very jarring. It can be like, wow, this is like, you're not into this. Like, it feels disruptive. It feels like you're not into me. We can make stories up about it. And for that sensate person, it's worth it to them to stop and to get the mood correct, because that's going to actually allow them to go into the experience and to go deeper in their pleasure, enjoyment, and ability to be present with their partner. And so then when we start to understand each other's libido codes and we start to understand Then we can set up scenarios where it's like, okay, I'm going to try to really turn my partner on tonight. What is going to be the best thing for that? When we understand each other's codes, we can start setting individual scenes. Like another type is the giver. The giver is the person that actually gets more turned on by giving versus receiving. So knowing that about somebody, you're going to approach that person different and maybe like get into more of a surrender standpoint with that person because they're going to get turned on by giving you the pleasure. So that's the benefit of knowing the codes is like we can just miss each other by just like the love languages. They're kind of like sex languages. Like we just don't know them. And if we don't know them, we can be speaking completely different languages. So again, everybody go take my free code quiz so you can learn because I think it'd really help you. It's libidocode.com.
It's interesting because listening listen to you speak, sex and with couples, when you're speaking, it sounds like there's so many layers to it, and there are in reality. And I think a lot of times when we're with someone, we're not thinking about the layers. We might be primarily thinking about our satisfaction. So we're not thinking about some of these things that you're speaking of. And I wanted to touch base on something that you said because I think this affects a lot of people. When I heard the word, I thought more of men, but I'm sure it could be flipped to women too, is rejection. Because a lot of times couples are, one can try something or in the mood, let's just say, and they get rejected for whatever reason. The other party could be tired, not feeling it. And I wonder sometimes, or maybe in your practice, has that come up a lot where one party feel like they're trying to initiate, they're trying to really stimulate, but they're constantly being rejected?
I mean, I think that's exactly what happens. And we can get into this very, very vicious cycle, right, with rejection. And I think it's not talked about a lot because oftentimes I think when we think about rejection, we think about rejection with dating. It's like, oh, they didn't call or they didn't break up with me in a nice way or they broke up with me at all or whatever it is, right? So it's like we think about it with dating. But what we don't realize is that oftentimes in our long-term relationships that sometimes we can be like subtly doing these almost like these micro rejections over and over and over again. And that actually can be really impactful to the relationship. And the worst part of it is that a lot of times we aren't even realizing we're doing it because it's like we're missing the messages. And when we're missing the messages, we can be sending out a signal that is very different than we would be sending out if we actually, had the messages correct to begin with. So there are so many subtleties, like you said, like it's like we think that sex is just like, oh, this like ABC thing. And that's how it's often taught. But it's really so much more intricate than that, especially in these longer term relationships. And especially when we get into talk about hetero relationships and the differences between male arousal and female arousal are so drastically different. Yet even in medical school, we were taught they were exactly the same.
No, vastly different. Vastly different. Now, here's something that I find to be utterly amazing: a sexless marriage. Now, to me, I just find how could you? I'm sure things go on, so I'm not going to act like I don't have an idea of that. But to me, if you're in a household with someone that you're into, you care about, you love, and there's some attraction there, how does a sexless marriage continue on? What is really could be going on behind the scenes in a sexless marriage?
I think it's such an important question. And, to answer that too, I want to start with like looking at like, why is this a problem? And truthfully, I think there's some couples that it's not a problem, but in general, I think it is because when we look, for example, at people, at relationships and long-term couples who report having the happiest relationships, that are the most satisfied with every aspect of their relationship, one of the things we see is in surveys, they are having sex on average 50 times a year. So just barely less than that once a week time period, right? And there's so many couples that I wind up meeting that haven't had sex in a year or longer. So what is happening to that? And what is the impact on the relationship? And there's a lot of different things we could break down here. Like sometimes it's as simple as this type of scenario. The man gets erectile dysfunction, or a woman gets something like vaginal dryness or pelvic pain. They have a run at it. It doesn't feel good to her, or it doesn't work for him. And neither person wants to say much about it because they're worried about hurting their partner that they love so much. And they try it a couple times. Maybe they even try talking about it. The one person gets upset or offended or embarrassed. And all of a sudden it's swept under the rug and nobody talks about it ever again. So it can be something like that. It can be these other, another huge thing I think is we stop realizing it's a priority. And I think with pleasure, back to my original story around pleasure being something that pleasure being not just about desire, but something we require. A lot of people don't see that. And pleasure has this orientation of being like hedonistic in some traditions and in some beliefs around like, oh, this is bad. The pursuit of pleasure is bad. We don't actually realize what happens when we actually engage in pleasure and the healing power of things like oxytocin. It's like oxytocin, which is our pleasure hormone, our cuddle hormone, our orgasm hormone. Oxytocin will not only bond people closer together, but it increases serotonin, our happy hormone. It balances dopamine that I've talked about. It improves sleep. It's even been shown in some studies to build bone. It also helps to improve cortisol, our stress hormone, and lower cortisol levels. So the stress goes down, which often means that belly fat can go down with it. So we have all of these health benefits that come from pleasure, but oftentimes it is thought as selfish. It is thought as something that we don't have time for. And I think sometimes there is something that has gone on where it's like there's underlying fighting or there's underlying things, maybe words unsaid, and or something like ED or pelvic pain or vaginal dryness. And all that being said, I think for a lot of couples, one of the things that happens is people just get so busy in between the work and the jobs and trying to get workouts in and stay in shape and do all the things that, that we try to do as humans to live our best life. And sometimes it's just one of those things where it's like, well, I just don't have time for that anymore. And days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years. And so that's one of the reasons I like to talk about all the benefits, because just like somebody who's been eating, fast food and all of a sudden they switch and they're like, okay, I'm going to motivate myself to eat healthy because I know all the benefits and I'm really trying to live my best self or be around for my grandchildren or whatever it is. The same thing I think happens when we start to understand like the molecules that get secreted when we prioritize this. There's not anything else that is free that I feel like has this level of capacity of healing and of support for both the individual and for the couple. And we just don't, it's like just not talked about as a priority. So it just sometimes just doesn't get prioritized. And there goes the years.
Yeah. I love the healing aspect of it. I love that taking some of that away from the satisfaction. I like that. And the priority, making that priority. And to hear, I'm just not into that. I don't want that anymore. It's amazing to me to say you love someone and don't make them a priority. If you're
Yeah.
around each other, that to me, I've always that spun my brain a little bit because I don't understand that how you're in love with someone, but they're not your priority, or you make everything else a priority. Like you were speaking of their job, they're working on everything else becomes a priority, but that person that you're involved with that has your heart and they have yours, they're not. It's something it's a slogan you have, and I love the slogan. I really do. It's a word that we won't even hear too often to think about when it comes to modern day living, monogamy. But you took the phrase "modern monogamy is hot."
Yes.
Now, okay, I have to hear about this
Right.
because a lot of folks they look at monogamy, they're not thinking it's hot. But sometimes it seems like dirt is on it. But tell us, how is it hot?
Yeah, it's such an important question, right? And that's what I like. I think this question is actually, if I'm going to pick like one pinnacle of my work, it's really this, because traditional monogamy, if we look at the foundation of really where like what traditional monogamy was rooted in, it's a lot about, like, if you go back in history, it's a lot about forming a family unit where people do different jobs and they're coming together for stability, for support, to raise a family so that they can share job duties and really to build a life that is like, okay, foundationally safe and stable. Right. And so in traditional monogamy, like, yes, there's conversations about sex, but it really is always kind of like this secondary thing. It's like, okay, procreation, and like it's not ever like emphasized as a core root of the monogamy, which is why it's not hot, right? Because it's like, okay, well, you're focused on all these other things. And luckily in today's society, we are now at a point where the way we are coming together as people, as humans, has the ability to be so much more than just about stability. Like monogamy, and like in modern and hot monogamy, we can still have that, right? We can still work together to create a different life and share households and and support each other in many different mental, emotional, spiritual ways, raise kids together if that's our thing. All these different things, right? But what makes it different is in modern monogamy, that pleasure gets spoken about as one of the key parts of the conversation. And there's this continued conversation around how can we make this better from a standpoint and hotter from a standpoint of sex and intimacy. So one of the key things we see, and it's like, this is also really interesting in research when it comes to conversation, because one of the things that we see in the couples that are having that report having the hottest sex, having like the best sex life, 91% of them say they talk about it. That's a really crazy survey, right? 91% of people that are reporting having the best sex are actually communicating about it. So that is one of the core foundations of modern monogamy, is actually teaching couples how to begin to talk about this in ways that is not only like inspiring and stimulating and motivating them, but is also working to protect each other's egos. Because one of the things we see in conflict, in studies on conflict in couples, like if couples are going to get into a conflict, there's 3 threats. There's the threat to one partner, the threat to the other partner, and the threat to the relationship. And in regular conflict, those are all fairly like equal threats. But what's interesting in conversations about sex, the threat to oneself. If I bring up sex to a partner, the biggest thing that we see in surveys, that the biggest threat is not worried about my partner, not worried about the relationship, but worried about myself. And so because that, when we go into conversation around this, it's so easy for people to get defensive and agitated and not hear things correctly and things to get taken out of context. And and it's important to be bidirectionally aware of this. So part of the hot and modern monogamy is teaching people what are the foundational skills to begin to have these kind of conversations around sex, and to bring that novelty in, and actually to say, hey, yes, we are here in an amazing way to have stability, but we're also here to deeply heal each other and deeply support each other and deeply help each other enjoy life through pleasure. And when we do that and we bring that in as one of the forefronts of the relationship, so that becomes one of the, say the foundational tiers of the relationship, versus like the secondary thing that barely gets talked about and maybe not at all. That's what makes it hot, is because we start bringing in and say, what are we doing every week? What are we doing every month to take care of our passion? In my life, I have my business goals, and I also have pleasure goals. And I relook at my pleasure goals every 90 days. And every 90 days is, what am I doing? What am I doing with myself and my partner? I work very, very, very hard, but what am I doing to actually bring those pleasure components in to help me stay balanced, to help me stay in love, and to help me have that really amazing hot relationship? That's modern monogamy.
I like that. I hear a strong commitment from 2 individual people, not necessarily just to go outside of their relationship, but to work and improve and to maintain and grow what they have. So that's a big part of monogamy. I don't think we think about. A lot of times we look at the word, we just looking at, long as you don't, go sexually be with someone else, you're monogamous, but it's much deeper than that. And I want to go back to one thing we talked about a little earlier, as far as rejection. Because I think rejection, a lot of times, it may sound kind of crazy when I say this, and I may be way off base, but rejection to me, over and over, it starts to open the door to infidelity. Because a lot of times when someone's being rejected in a sexual sense, they start to question what this person feels about me. That other person may not be in the mood, may not really want to be part of them, but I think they start to think, if there's something wrong with me or they're not involved, let me find someone else that will see me a certain way. And I know infidelity resonates with you, your mission in helping couples long term sustain intimacy and trust. So I wanted to kind of roll into that a little bit because that's where I think sometimes the door for infidelity opens. Your thoughts?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, I think a lot of infidelity opens sometimes is as simple as, hey, making a decision to, to be in a situation that is not helpful. So it's like, oh, meeting a work colleague and you need to go out and do something together and there's an attraction and all of a sudden you let yourself have too many drinks. So there's like some things we do to put ourselves in situations that I think can proliferate that more easily. And I definitely think there's a huge part of it where when that bond starts to collapse, when that bond starts to not be as strong and this person becomes a roommate, a best friend, sometimes none of those, sometimes purely just like somebody you're co-creating kids and paying bills with. And when that rejection happens, it absolutely can break that down because it does internally make somebody oftentimes think like, what is happening to me? What am I doing wrong? Am I not beautiful? Am I not sexy? Am I not lovable? And then all of a sudden, and if we have too many of those thoughts that are not being repatterned with our relationship, then all of a sudden, when somebody comes along and it's like, wow, you are beautiful, you are sexy, you are hot, you are all these things, it can be very alluring. And there's parts of us, like as humans, that we all have different degrees of what we need to hear and have in our life, but there's definitely parts of all of us that I believe really need to feel loved and really need to feel like, yes, we are completely a amazing, hot, divine, sexy being. And so with that, one of the things that is most important is oftentimes, like you're saying, like oftentimes with rejection, it's not what it seems, meaning, oh, it could be this libido code turn on, misunderstanding each other. But what the brain loves to do when the brain doesn't understand something is make up stories and fill in information. So it's so easy as well for like, okay, in a hetero situation for, let's say, the man to have one night where pee goes soft in the middle of sex. Totally normal, happens to men all the time, happens to every man probably. But it's so then easy for like a female partner to be like, oh my gosh, he's not into me, he doesn't like my fat rolls here, my hips have gotten bigger, and oh my god, and the stories go on, and it has nothing to do that, he's just stressed out, period, right? Or whatever it is. And so one of the things that I think is really important is, rather than creating stories, I think one of the biggest things is to cultivate this type of relationship where we actually can name it. Oftentimes not in the moment. And this is what I work with couples too, is like say something like that happened, that, when it's appropriate, as soon as possible, the next day, just bring up and being like, hey, last night when that happened, I just started thinking all these things, like thinking like, you don't think I'm sexy, and just like being vulnerable to be like, and actually checking in and like, is that true? Is this what you're thinking? And so many times we just let these thoughts go through our mind, and like our mind just fills in gaps. So if we believe everything that goes through our mind, watch out, we are going to be taken down some rabbit holes. So when we can actually watch and say like, okay, well, this is what I'm thinking about that. And then in order to check ourselves, bring that back, instead of like I like the work that the Gottmans do a lot, the Gottman Institute, Amazing Relationship Institute. And they talk a lot about this concept of bidding towards our partner. And a bid is, you could look at it as like an approach, an advance. And it could be sexual, it could be emotional, it could be mental. And then they have done studies to say, hey, how many times can we in a relationship, if we have a partner bid, what is the ratio where you need to actually respond to the bid versus turn away? Right. And of course, more is better, but everybody's going to have the moments where it's like, I can't even respond to this for whatever reason. And so the biggest thing is if we're finding ourselves like almost doing that turn away where we're turning our back either physically or emotionally because that did not feel good, I didn't like that, then the more times we can actually bring that back to our partner and say like, hey, I found myself withdrawing because I started thinking these things. And I want to know if they're true. And that's very vulnerable because, of course, it's like, oh my gosh, what if they're true? Most of the time, they're not going to be true. And then you can start to work and understand, oh, this is what's happening for each other. And you can start turning towards each other in these moments instead of away.
Hmm. Communication sounds like it's the key. Clear communication sounds like it's the key here.
Yeah, to
Oh,
great sex, to everything. But sex is like, you got to communicate to have a great sex. And even with it, the
hmm.
number of women, especially men too, but the number of women that are having what I call the wrong kind of sex, which basically means they're going through these motions that they've seen in movies or porn that are not, most ways that couples are having sex are not designed for the uniqueness of the female anatomy. And women get disinterested because it's like not that interesting for their pleasure body. And then you get into a vicious cycle that way. And the only way out of it is to actually understand the uniqueness of the female pleasure body. And you can't do that without talking about it.
Hmm. That's interesting. Where when you say that she's basically going through the motions, and it's sad in a way that we have allowed television and pornography, for the most part, for men to basically give us an idea what sex is supposed to be like, and
Oh,
they've kind of a lot of our heads kind of basically gave us the format what we should be doing. If we're not doing it, we're not thinking we're having good sex.
it's so true. Like that classic scene, this drives me so nuts when I see this over and over and over again in movies, which is like, okay, there's this like passion and there's this heat and there's this desire. And then there's like this one moment and like they rip each other's clothes off and they have sex for like 2 minutes. And it's like the best orgasm and it's fireworks and everybody's having a great time. And that is BS. It is just like it is not realistic. Like because of how testosterone acts on the vasculature versus estrogen, females need blood flow to go to their genitals just like male do. Like there's like females get an erection, it just doesn't look the same way as a male, but you get blood flow, the clitoris gets engorged, the vulva gets engorged, the vagina gets engorged, so you get all this blood flow. But what's interesting, and that's when sex feels really good for women, is when there's more blood, right? Same with men, we both need blood flow to go to our genitals. And so what's really interesting is because estrogen impacts the blood vessels differently than testosterone and females respond differently, it actually is going to take women about 20 minutes of some sort of foreplay, some sort of inspiration to get the blood flow to their genitals where they are actually fully aroused. And most of the time, start A, like point A to point B, doesn't even come close to 20 minutes. And so women are having sex so much of the time without fully being engorged. And not saying it can't still feel good for some women, of course it can, but to really get to that like height of being actually able to completely enjoy pleasure, it takes most women 20 minutes to get there. And I've never seen a movie actually in my entire life that portrays anything like that. And so, it serves in a hetero scenario, it serves like both the man and the woman. It really like serves them both, because the vicious cycle we get into here is like women think there's something wrong with them oftentimes, like they think they can't orgasm, there's something wrong with them. And and women know typically how much men love to provide pleasure for them, and so they wanted their man to feel excited about providing pleasure, but then they're not feeling all this pleasure because it takes 20 minutes and they think there's something wrong with them because they don't know this. And so then that's where faking comes in, that's where disinterest comes in. And then for the male standpoint, it can also backfire because they want to provide pleasure and they want to be this huge active participant in their women's pleasure. And then all of a sudden, like either they can see the disinterest, and sometimes they can even think there's something wrong with her because they see, oh, this is how sex is supposed to be since it's portrayed. And it's just this big disaster, it just is, which is why I like talking about it. So thank you for letting me talk about it.
When I came across this years ago, and there was a great percentage, I shouldn't say great, but there's a huge percentage of women not later on in life never experiencing an orgasm. And these women were married for, good period of time and never would stand proudly. I shouldn't say proudly, but would stand and say, I've never had an orgasm. And back then, when I would hear that, you start to think a lot of different things. But I wonder too, even with the 20 minutes, are women, maybe some of the women that you've came across, are they really understanding their bodies? Because I could say a lot of men don't understand a woman's body per se, but are women understanding their bodies? Are they just basically, some of these women that not have experiencing orgasms, are they kind of just rolling along in a sense of being a wife or being in a relationship and just showing up and maybe not understanding their own bodies?
I think there's a huge, huge, huge part of that. I think we're not taught to explore our bodies as much as women. And I think oftentimes, like, kind of back to medical school, like the way that female anatomy is often described is like, okay, well, this part works like that male part. It's almost like this, it's like, okay, the female version of male, genitalia. And it's really like it's not that it's wrong, like you can correlate it that way, but I think it's a huge disservice because there are so many differences. And when like people read online, right, and it's like, oh, G-spot orgasm, holy grail of orgasm is what you'll see. And then in G-spot orgasm, certain positions, sexual positions, will really stimulate that. Certain sex toys will stimulate that. But some women, this area has scar tissue over it where it can be numb. Other women, it is painful. So there's different, it's like one of these things is understanding is like, it's because of this, because of where scar tissue could form, because of blood flow, because of anatomy, like even simple things. Like it's been studied that the distance between where the clitoral bulb is compared to the vaginal opening, if it's closer together on a woman, it'll be way easier for most women to have orgasms with penetration alone. The further the distance that is, the harder it is for a woman to have orgasms with penetrative sex alone. And so for women like that, with that further distance, just different anatomy, it's all it is, there needs to oftentimes be a different combination stimulation when they are having intercourse. And if we don't know this, we think like, oh my gosh, we keep trying the same things over and over again and it's not working. We think we're broken. And so there's so much to be said around learning one's own anatomy. Another thing we see is that oftentimes like the right side of the vulva will be more or less sensitive than the left. Sometimes the inner or outer labia are more sensitive or less. Some women can have these amazing labia orgasms, right? Other women, it's not that interesting. So how can we begin to tell our partners to like, oh, a little more to the left, or, like, can we shift our hips this way or try that slightly different position, or I need you to touch me here when we're having intercourse. We can't do any of that if we don't actually understand the uniqueness of our own anatomy. And none of it's good or bad. None of it's right or wrong. It's just the unique, beautiful expression of how we're made and our unique anatomy that way.
I'm curious, when a couple decides to reach out to you, the majority of the time, is it him or her that's kind of leading the pack?
Interesting enough, it's usually her. And
Okay.
and it's almost surprising to me because I do find oftentimes, like externally in society, I would think that men would be more oriented from a standpoint of, buying products and, trying different products, right? Different products that are like bring more blood flow or things like that. There is a predominance in men. But when it comes to actually, hey, let's get together and talk about it, and I talk about techniques, for example, and how to have these conversations and all these things, when it comes to those intricacies, it is oftentimes more the female that is reaching out. But I work with a lot of couples, so sometimes it's a group decision, but tends to be more like products that the men tend to go after, and more tends to be more female motivated, at least in my experience.
Okay. I mean, we were speaking earlier about the codes. I thought about this, the unique codes in a sense. What if, because sometimes you can have one partner a little bit more expressive, maybe more kinkier than the other, and the other partner may not, their code may not line up with that. How does that work for a couple?
It's a really great question. And that's where understanding is absolutely the first step, right? And and to define kinky, to go into this question just for everybody, like kinky by definition is, I think people get it like kinky and fetishes really confused. Kinky is just outside of the norm, is really all that kink means. So if like the norm for your relationship or somebody's relationship is missionary sex and that's all you do, you do a different position and, you're motivated to a different position, that could be considered a kink because it's outside of the norm. Versus fetishes are more like, hey, like more almost these obsessions with certain things like toes, for example. So just to differentiate that a little bit, but I think in the point of the question of your question is really like, what happens if we have these kind of different types of styles? What happens if my code is different than my partner's code? And this is where the conversation is absolutely foundational. So this is also where I find like yes, no, maybe lists come in handy. So this is something that you can make these your own. I'm actually in the process of making one of these right now. So I will have that on my website soon. So if people go to mylibidodoc.com, you'll find that'll be up like in the next few weeks here. And so the idea of this is to go through and kind of sit down with your partner and be like, okay, you fill out these questionnaires separately. And the questionnaires are like things like, yes, I will try this. No, I will not try that. Okay. In the right situation, I could try that. And when we do these lists and it'll incorporate all 5 different things of the code, what we're looking for here is areas where we're both yeses, or there's a combination of yes and maybe. So there will definitely be things when we have these different styles that are like, okay, well, that's just not going to be on the table for one partner. But when we do these types of yes, no, maybe lists, what it opens up is like, there's actually a lot more overlap and a lot more areas that we can play. And with maybe, what comes up is like, okay, well, if somebody's yes about something and somebody else is maybe about something, then the conversation is stuff like, okay, well, in what situations would you be comfortable turning your maybe into a yes? So it comes down to those figuring out some of those creative ways we overlap and then having more of that conversation. And those are the types of exercises that I find can get people of different codes much more on the same page.
Sounds good. Let's talk about your website because that's a website indeed. So you you spoke of my libido doc, if I said that correctly.
Yeah.
But please let's talk about your website because I really think couples should really take a visit there. So enlighten us about your website.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you guys should definitely check out, or a couple of things you should definitely check out. So I gave you guys the libido code. There's also libidoquiz.com. So if you go to libidoquiz.com, that one's really cool because it goes through the main root causes, like physical root causes of low libido. So whether somebody is just like, I'm not in the mood ever, or there's some sort of imbalance such as ED or vaginal pain, or there's just too tired, whatever it is, right? It'll take you through quiz. And then what it's going to do when you get your quiz answers is it's going to send you information around lab tests specific to your quiz answers that you should ask your doctor about, as well as lifestyle things about your quiz answers that might help to solve that gap. So super useful there to make sure you're really being thorough about like getting the right lab test related to, what's going on for you. So that's libidoquiz.com. Another thing you'll find on my site, which you can also get at hotterlife.com, is a free ebook, which is it's called Revive Your Love Life. And it's 5 easy steps for mind-blowing orgasms and romance. So that's at hotterlife.com. And then you also will find on my website, you'll find my podcast. I release episodes weekly, except for a couple times a year where I take short breaks. And you'll also find on there my blogs. We have blogs going out about every week. And it's really just like an educational, the purpose of the site, in addition to looking in and joining my Hot and Modern Monogamy Club, which you can join off the site. In addition to those, it's also just a place where it's like I throw stuff up. I spend a lot of time in research, and my work is to help really people like sort through what we see on there to say, from science, from medicine, from research, how do we really do this? How do we really stimulate passion and desire in long-term monogamy? And you'll find all that on the site and more.
It's amazing because realistically, I said earlier, I never spoke with a sexologist before, but listening to a lot that you said, I think a lot of couples should make a call to a sexologist, realistically, because over a period of time, it could be due to a lack of communication, lack of understanding. You open up a lot of doors of thought that go into a healthy sex life for a couple. And if you just brought that in this short period of time, I can imagine if they spend time with you, picking your brain and asking you questions. I can only imagine how they walk away and how could it benefit their relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's the passion, right? Is really helping couples have that type of relationship that I think we just, we dream of and we deserve, and one that you're growing closer in every way every year. And it's not to say, of course, it's like it's human life. Of course, there's bumps along the road, but we're not taught this stuff in school. Like I said, like not even in medical school was I taught this. I had to go out and do a ton of research on my own to learn all this stuff. So if you're not talking to somebody, how are you going to actually ever know this? Because it's not out there otherwise.
Okay. Now you're an author as well.
I
Am I
am.
correct?
I am.
And
Yeah.
then tell us about your book. Come on, don't be shy. Come on.
My current book is called It's Not in Your Mind, and it's all about chronic illness, and it's amazing, best-selling author, and that's an exciting book. That's for people that are much more sick. So if anybody is really struggling with health, that's a great book for you. And then I am in the middle of writing a 3-book series, a 3-part series. I have part 1 and 2 done as far as the first draft. So they're in second draft mode now. So that is called Want to Want It. It'll be coming out in, like I said, in 3 parts. And that is all about this stuff. So that's where I'm going to go into everything we're doing here. Part 1 and 2, I'm hoping to get out by the end of 2025. So it'll be sometime around that if we hit our deadlines and our goals. And then part 3 will be out then in 2026. So definitely pay attention to the website, Want to Want It. It'll be coming down the pipeline soon.
Okay. You know what? I'd like to have you come back when they're out,
I
and we
would
could
love
talk
that.
about that. Yeah, sounds
Yeah, I
good.
would love that. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate you for coming by. I'm gonna give some last words to folks that are listening because for me it's been very enlightening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think my final thing to just say is just, remembering that pleasure is not just about desire, it's something you require. And remembering that couples that play together stay together. We see that so, so clearly in surveys and research that when we put effort into this, that bond does grow. And your relationship are worth it, because when that is strong, the trickle down impact of that, I think throughout life, this is what dreams and dynasties are made out of. So, just remember, couples that play together stay together. And I wish you all the best in your relationships. And if I can help anybody, you know how to get a hold of me.
Thank you much. That's Dr. Diane Muller, the board certified sexologist. And I hear again, I love the slogan, modern monogamy is hot. That I love. You should put that on a t-shirt, realistically.
I should. Yes,
T-shirt.
thank you for the swag idea.
Yeah, I think you should. I want to thank you folks for giving us an ear, giving us a listen. As I always say to you, God loves you and I love you too. Till the next time, take care of yourself.